Welcome to One Artificial Intelligence. One Artificial Intelligence brings together the leaders shaping the evolution of artificial intelligence across various industries. It is a platform for innovators, pioneers, and decision makers who are advancing AI and translating its promise into measurable performance, long-term advantage, and responsible growth. So thank you for joining us here on the One Business World platform. It is now my great pleasure to welcome as our next speaker, Andreu. He is the CEO of Constella Intelligence, and his topic is Adversarial Intelligence, How AI Powers the Next Wave of Cybercrime. Good afternoon. How are you doing? Good to see you again. Thanks for joining us last week in New York. Good to be back with you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Good to see you again, Glenn.
Let me hand it off over to you. We look forward to your remarks, and I don't know. It's got that kind of title where, I'm an old fan of the TV series The Untouchables, but I think we're going to go much deeper, much deeper, much deeper than that. So let me turn it over to you.
All right, appreciate that. Thanks for having me. So this talk is really about the changing landscape in terms of attacker economics. And the economics that the adversarials play by are real. They have bosses, they have deadlines, they have budgets. And so they pretty much these days operate as a legitimate business, if you will. The biggest shift that we are going to focus on with this talk here is that AI doesn't really make these adversaries, these attackers, magical. It's a tool that's empowering them, but there's no black magic here. So understanding how this stuff works is important. At the end of the day, it's AI that really gives them a certain level of leverage. And that's an important notion to bear in mind as we go through this talk. And that leverage, if you think about it, really comes down to them being quicker on the draw. They start faster. They work with more polish. Their content is very tight. The code that gets generated by AI engines is very strategic. And then on top of that, they get to operate a far greater level of actual attempts in parallel, considering what was possible in the past. And so that's why I phrase this as adversarial intelligence. I'm not talking about LLMs or SLMs or any chatbots. I'm talking about adversaries combining intelligence, automation, synthetic content, and really workflow support in terms of scale to improve their outcomes given an attack lifecycle. And we'll look at that lifecycle in a minute. But so really what we're going to focus on here are the main two traditional forces that come down to facilitation and scale. But before we get into that, why does this matter now? And it matters because AI has lowered the barrier to entry into cybercrime to relatively zero. Tasks that used to require more time, more skill, more coordination can now be generated and launched by actors with little to no capabilities or knowledge, and they end up with a higher quality of output irrespective of their level of skill. And it all comes down to AI engines powering their efforts. Now, at the same time, what we see is that the use of AI has eroded digital trust. And a lot of the human signals that organizations and humans relied on in the past are no longer reliable. Voice, video, tone, familiarity, urgency, social proof, all of those are signals that used to help people decide what was real. And now those signals can be synthetically generated and in turn weaponized. And so defenders are really getting hit from multiple angles simultaneously. And if you think about it, they're facing a higher level of volume, of attack volume. On top of that, the content that's within that volume is so much more convincing that the problems have compounded and the actual challenges that we're up against are exponentially larger than in the past. And what this comes down to is that the controls that we used to put in place in enterprises, for instance, static controls, manual reviews, one-time awareness training, annual pen tests, those are no longer enough, especially by themselves. And so this is not just a security problem from an operational perspective. This is a finance problem, a customer success problem, a customer trust problem. So there's a lot of business risk here in terms of companies and where they're going and how they're operating these days. So I always like to bring this down to the simplest factors that I could come up with, and really facilitation and scale are those two factors. And we'll get into details for each one of those in a bit, but ultimately, facilitation is AI making, like I said earlier, lowering that barrier to entry, making these attacks easier. And by the way, when I say attacks, I'm talking about full campaigns. I'm not talking about like a SQL injection attack against one application. These are full campaigns that can get operationalized. AI helps with writing code, with writing content, with translation. In other words, these are multilingual, these are international level attacks, and then with planning and development and actual iterations. And so if you factor in that facilitation and you compound it with scale means that AI can multiply attempts, multiply adaptations. That's important because that means these engines can actually generate, adaptations based on responses. And so these are not static attacks. These are intelligent attacks. And when you add in parallelism, you can generate scale that's just again on an unprecedented level. And once an adversary has a workflow at that level that works, the AI just makes it faster across way more targets than they could have actually leveraged if the work was being done manually as it was historically. And so ultimately what this comes down to is time compression. So the distance between an idea, a lure, a campaign generation, that shrinks. That distance, that distance between compromise and actual monetization of an attack shrinks. And so what defenders had in the past was sometime between a vulnerability, for instance, being discovered and an exploit being written. That time compression factor gives the attackers a distinct advantage at this point. And so facilitation. So let's start with facilitation at some level of detail. And because this is where, if you think about it, attackers' lives just get easier. So AI can help in terms of actual malware generation, the components. It can write code, it can explain code, it can troubleshoot errors. Troubleshooting historically has been very time consuming at a code level. And if you're not a software engineer, troubleshooting was always challenging. Now AI engines can do it for you. And that trial and error that comes in terms of actually seeing what could potentially leverage openings within an ecosystem, that trial and error gets sped up to really a daunting level. And so even when the output of these engines is imperfect, it still reduces the time needed to get something usable by the attackers. And that really matters because if you think about it, attackers don't need perfection. They just need enough capability to get in and or to move forward. And so let's move on to deepfakes and impersonation. So this is where digital trust really, like I said earlier, is eroding rather quickly. The cost of creating believable identity abuse, in other words, fake voice, fake face movement, fake language, fake cadence, that cost has reduced down to a factor that it really is accessible to just about anybody. And so the fact that these things can be leveraged in real time, in other words, you can actually have a video happening, a full video request response conversation and all that happening with a fully digital fraudulent persona, but behind the scenes is an actual person and that same voice is carried over. And so it's very difficult for a normal human to determine whether a video, for instance, is a deep fake. And by video, I mean in terms of interaction. So just the way we're having here. So Glenn and I can speak to each other, but I could literally just change my face and he wouldn't be able to tell the difference in terms of who he's actually interacting with. And so this kind of leads into the notion of vibe hacking because AI has a strong capability in terms of doing things like sentiment analysis and actually being able to manipulate the vibe of a human being, the emotional variables, urgency, authority, response to authority, empathy, familiarity, embarrassment, fear. all of those human elements can be manipulated by AI once that AI figures out what makes this target individual click. And so ultimately, facilitation, like I said, brings the barrier to entry, the skill level quite low. It raises the actual content creation, the strategic nature of the content that gets created, and really it makes the iteration cycles just happen so much faster. And so one of the areas that you really need to focus on if you want to understand what's happening here are dark LLMs. WormGPT, FraudGPT, Kawaii GPT. There's tons of them at this point. The point is that these are LLMs that work with you the same way, for instance, ChatGPT or Gemini do, but from a nefarious perspective. So, you can train LLMs in terms of cyber criminal content, and then basically get the same benefit that you would from a normal or productive GPT engine. And so this becomes quite interesting in terms of the tool set that attackers have at their disposal. For example, I've given a demo where 3 prompts, strategically worded prompts, actually generate an entire ransomware campaign. I've also given another one that shows the creation of an info stealer. Again, zero skill involved. You just have to know how to interact with these engines and get back out code that makes sense and or campaign content or even the campaign workflow. And so these LLMs are rather interesting. Some of them you can only access on the dark web, so it caters to a specific type of audience, but some of them operate on the surface web. And you also obviously have to be careful because some of them are scams. And so you get charged for the use of something that turns out to not generate any real nefarious content. But the ones that do work are quite effective. And I mean, I've used them and I can tell you that it's pretty disturbing what they can come up with. So let's move over to scale, because if facilitation makes all of that work easier, scale makes an operation bigger. And so AI, especially with the agentic models that are now possible, what this means is that models can be chained into workflows. They can be assigned subtasks that happen in parallel. They can be used to coordinate reconnaissance, lore creation, translation, triage, follow-ups. In a distributed model, agents can communicate with each other. And for example, if you think of a distributed denial of service attack, all of these sub-agents can be attacking a target. And when the target figures out a pattern and protects against it, any one of these agents can react to that and let the other ones know, and they all adjust accordingly. And so the DDoS days that are coming are actually quite intelligent and adaptive. And so it is quite concerning here. But at the end of the day, the real advantage isn't only speed, it's concurrency. It's that ability to operate from a parallel perspective. And so adversaries can now run more experiments, more messages, more trial and error, they can target more identities, they can create more attackable profiles off of extremely large data sets. And then they can target more pathways without having to grow a human team because you have this distributed agentic model that can perform all of those functions. And so if we go back to the vibe hacking notion, introduce the concept of persuasion, and persuasion scales as well. So, hyper personalization, if done from a human perspective, can be quite expensive. Now it can entirely be automated and continuously improved. And so, for example, a message can be adjusted based on a target's title, their role, their geography, company content or public content relevant to that target. And you can also start introducing emotional triggers like the vibe hacking we spoke about, again, without introducing the requirement of a human writer for every one of those touch points. And so what that means is I can create a generic campaign and target, let's say, 1,000 different people, and the content will get modified accordingly based on those 1,000 targets. And I don't have to do anything extra other than create that campaign properly. And so that's why this entire notion of scale and how it impacts cybercrime, it's become industrialized. And that's a key point here because once attackers find a pattern that converts into results, into an outcome, they can replicate that broadly. And like I said earlier, make it adaptive to a given environment. And so think about it in terms of AI not only providing scale and output, but it learns. And that's where it starts to become quite advanced and quite challenging for defenders. So none of this happens in a vacuum. All of this sits on top of an ecosystem, and what drives that ecosystem is data. And if you think about this from I call it the dark social layer here. Well, if you think about it from that perspective, that becomes the connective tissue around cybercrime. So, like private channels, for instance, Telegram channels, semi-open communities, marketplaces, brokers, ephemeral or burner identities, they all help these actors create campaigns, share playbooks, distribute tools, trade data. That's a key point to all of this because without the data, a lot of these attack campaigns are not possible. And so what makes these ecosystems super powerful, it's not so much the reach, it's the resilience that actually exists within those ecosystems. And so, privacy first design and easy account turnover and rapid reformation of communities, it means takedowns of these channels, these ecosystems are quite challenging and really less decisive than a defender would hope. And so that's why ecosystems like Telegram flourish within the cyber criminal ecosystem. And so, if you take it back outside of the cybercrime space and think about it in terms of business, most of these environments behave like growth operations. They are they are performing their functions, they're learning, they're adapting, they're attracting users, they're segmenting communities, they're pushing updates, they're distributing services, and all of that, if you think about it, unemotionally, is operational growth, just the same way a business grows. And so that means cybercrime is getting to the point that it's not really a technical activity anymore. It is an organized distribution challenge for the defenders, especially. And so when we think about this notion of AI-enabled attacks, we really do need to think about this ecosystem that sustains the attacker's ecosystem. And so again, from a business perspective, I think that's a key point, especially if you come from the defending world, because understanding your enemy as best as possible really puts you in an advantageous position. And one of the things to understand is exactly this, the operationalization of AI end to end. And what that means is that if you combine facilitation, scale, and an ecosystem, you can see how AI really can design an entire campaign from zero to outcome, and put that into the hands of many people. The scale factor starts to become pretty scary. And so the simplest sequence that I could break it down to was this. It's harvest, persuade, breach, and monetize. So in the harvest phase, you see things like AI supported OSINT interactions where you can pull details together on targets, on executives, on employees, on humans, and you can pull them out from disparate sources and bring them together in automated form. And as an adversary, they are then able to build subjective content, very strategic content, and in many cases with greater consistency than they could if they were doing this work manually. In the persuasion phase, this is where context becomes that lore that they use to actually engage with the targets. So emails, chats, SMS, voice, video, they can all be weaponized against a target. And because that content can be adjusted dynamically, that adaptation I mentioned earlier, the adversary is no longer relying on static messages or static content. They can refine as they go, and in some cases, allow that refinement to be automatic. In the breach phase, AI doesn't have to replace every technical step. That's just reality. So in terms of it being useful, it only has to reduce friction enough to be successful. Doesn't have to be perfect. Just reduce the friction enough to have an outcome. And this can include, code assistance, code QA, troubleshooting, the creation of droppers, loaders, session hijack support, the stealing of active session objects. All of that comes into play in the actual breach phase, and that's what leads to monetization. And I mean, the end goal here is cash or leverage, because it could be for ransom purposes. But things like business email compromise, invoice fraud, credential resell, extortion, all of those elements come into play on the monetization, and really identity abuse, because at the end of the day, identity abuse can take many angles, but in modern times, it has come down to identities and what can be done in terms of either making them attackable profiles or making them specific targets. And so I always encourage defenders, leaders in the defense space, CISOs and cybersecurity leaders, to think about AI-enabled cybercrime as an operating system, not a collection of little tricks and or tactics, techniques, and procedures, TTPs. So if you think larger in terms of this operationalization, this operating system, you start to get a more realistic concept of what is possible these days. So as a case study, I'd like to just keep this grounded in a case study that really impacted more consumers, regular humans, than employees of specific organizations. And this is the National Public Data, or NPD, sextortion wave that took place I think it started late 2023 and ran into 2024. And so what happened was the NPD data breach really exposed a tremendous amount of identity-rich data. And that data became the raw material for a campaign that touched many humans. So, like I said, this started in late 2023. And that timing matters because it really reminds us of the damage that a breach often brings with it, because breaches are no longer isolated incidents. They are industrialized against other breach sets, and the attacker ends up with a much more rich data set that they can use. And so this is important for AI-enabled threat environments, because AI amplifies that value of the exposed data. It can help refine and make very strategic text. In other words, I can make it subjective to you because I know specific elements of data about you, my target. It can support impersonation. It can, personalize coercion. It can scale at a level that, like I said earlier, is unprecedented. And so a particular breach isn't the end of a story. It's the beginning of a much larger downstream attack chain. And once you start realizing that, you start realizing how, for example, ATPs can also target organizations the same way these kind of campaigns can target individual users or consumers. And so think of large exposed data sets no longer as just a privacy problem. It's still a privacy problem, but it is not solely or exclusively a privacy problem. They're now fuel for personalized targeting, for convincing pretexting, for subjective content, for these sextortion type waves, and really identity-driven exploitation at scale. So where does this leave defenders, really? Understanding the attack surface of everything that makes up an AI ecosystem becomes quite important, especially if you want any chance at building subjective protective mechanisms. This attack surface is always going to continue to expand, and it's no longer about just identities or just about email or any of that. A key concept to take away from this is content is code. And what that means is that in AI connected environments, prompts, documents, messages, memory dumps, retrieve content, they can all influence system behavior in a way that feels closer to execution than just static content. And so concepts like AI worms and what they can do in terms of horizontal movement become quite critical. So even if nothing else, you can build yourself some mechanisms that can hone in on how a worm is expanding within an environment and use it as an early warning system. At the lowest level, at the most simplest basic level, it can become a very effective early warning system that your organization is being targeted. And so if you think about, for example, AI powered assistants, they're connected to memory, to tools, to actions. They have access to all kinds of things that can really empower malicious workflows. And those AI agents that support your employees can also move through trusted channels in a way that, for example, a human may have challenges uh, performing. And so all of this really starts to become important from the concept of synthetic identities. And AI really allows for very strategic and effective creation of forged media, uh, like I said earlier, attackable, very subjective attackable profiles, simulating background history, and really elements of data that make up a human can all be synthetically generated now. And this means identity proofing workflows and actual business decisions are now part of your attack surface as a defender. They're part of the battleground here. And, defenders can't focus exclusively on that middle circle, in other words, the model, because you hear a lot about, prompt engineering and securing the model, but it goes way beyond that. You have to secure the entire system around the model, the APIs that touch that model, the integrations, memory stacks, the retrieval layers, the control pathways, ingress and egress pathways. Add to that identity checks. Really, you have to start looking at your attack surface holistically because AI really empowers it at that larger ecosystem level. So the operating model for defenders has undeniably changed. And, first of all, the verification of humans as a control is essential now. It's no longer a nice to have or a courtesy. If you don't have it, your people will fall prey to very convincing fraudulent digital data. And so high impact requests like money transfers and stuff like that really have to have safe callbacks, out of band confirmation, multiple levels of approval, payment gates, anything that can verify. I always use the example of if I'm on a video with somebody and I want to verify who they are, if I have that person's cell phone number, I call them. And if they're not picking up that phone and the conversation I'm hearing is what I'm seeing, then obviously this is a fraudulent, this is fraudulent activity. And so if you think about it from a simple perspective, if a workflow relies on familiarity alone, then it's exposed. And so we have to move beyond that. We really have to pursue strong verification systems. Hardening AI applications the way you would harden any production system is a given at this point. That means architectural review, logging, segmentation, proper testing, proper red teaming, secrets handling, change control, all of those, and clear ownership also, because in some environments it's not quite clear who exactly owns these applications because enterprises rushed into deploying AI technologies without putting all of these proper controls in place. Then shifting from static signatures and IOCs of the past towards behavior. Focusing on behavior is what we have to start doing because AI-enabled attacks can mutate, they can adapt, and you have to build mechanisms that can really pursue those type of attacks on that same level. And so you need instrumentation for anomalies in processes and sequences and accesses in workflows in decision behavior. A lot of AI systems are starting to get pushed into decision-making capabilities and being able to move beyond, for example, checking the static list of signatures into behavioral anomaly, pattern detection. That's at this point, unfortunately, no longer a nice to have. It's what has to happen. Isolating content is important as well, especially for high trust actions. Like I used the financial transfer example earlier. So, prompt and content isolation, it's an opportunity not only to block, it's where you can shape and study and instrument potential adversarial behavior. If an organization does this well, you can turn attacker automation not only into an early warning system, but really a teaching mechanism where your security operations teams and engines can learn off of the activities that are taking place against your organization. And finally, I just want to give a couple of key takeaways because I know that it's a lot to digest in terms of how rapidly this is moving. But I'd like to finish here with these four key points. Um, First, AI and enhanced adversaries, they're not winning, like I said in the beginning, because any of this is auto magical. It's not. They're winning because AI has improved the facilitation and scale simultaneously. It really comes down to that asymmetric advantage, if you will. And understanding that gives you at least a starting point in terms of building some solid protective mechanisms. Synthetic trust signals are now weaponized. It's that simple. Voice, tone, facial expressions, context, none of those can be treated as reliable by default at this point. So traditional verification methods are dead. Any workflow that depends on those older signals is now vulnerable. And organizations have to come to terms with that. Executives have to come to terms with that because what was a nuisance to them before, for example, somebody from the help desk actually wanting verification that an executive is indeed requesting an action used to be something that annoyed executives, and the support personnel would fear, repercussion because they annoyed an executive. They have to get past that, these executives, and come to terms with the fact that digital trust has pushed things into this new realm. And so the system around the models, like I talked about earlier, it's part of your attack surface now. It's that simple. If as a leader you focus only on the model and ignore everything around it, the integrations, the identity, the memory, and all that, you're missing the actual target that could lead to some larger breach, to some larger problem for an organization. And so you have to be holistic in terms of your approach to understanding your attack surface. And look, at the end of the day, there's a real defensive opportunity here. Organizations that learn to convert this attacker automation into an early warning system, they're not going to just absorb information better. You're going to create decision advantage based on the fact that this activity against your organization is now teaching you. It's teaching your team. And so those are my key takeaways. I'd like to thank you all for listening, for paying attention. I hope you take something away from this and understand that, number one, AI has absolutely changed the game for the nefarious community. And number two, understanding the mindset of the attackers behind the use of AI is also a factor that has to be considered in your defensive strategies.
Andres, thank you very much. When's the book come out?
So the one that's there, that cover, that came out in November of 24. My new one is coming out, is actually in print now, so it should be out in a couple of months.
Okay,
It's just
terrific.
the adversarial mindset.
Well, after listening to your talk, I wonder why I will ever leave my room. You know, or my office or my house or.
No, I realize a lot of this comes off as fear mongering. That's not the intent. The intent is really awareness and education.
Yeah, no, I mean when you're dealing with uh, the lack of digital trust, I guess as somebody who's been on boards, who's part of governing organizations, I worked in regulation. I was at the New York Stock Exchange for many years, and you think about rules and things like that. As that trust continues to decline or lessen, can we get it back?
I don't think we can get it back. What we can do, like I mentioned a couple times here, is build other mechanisms to at least enhance that trust. There's no other way to put it. But going
Okay.
back to the old days, I think we're past that.
All right. So it's a matter of feeling somewhat more comfortable, but knowing that we have to be on guard then at at
Yeah.
a at a certain level. When you looked at your operating model, the uh, the deployed deception part was interesting because I think anybody following the recent set of events, we've seen like with the rescue last week of the airmen and stuff, it was all about not only focusing on them, but sending out, we're going to go this way, and maybe they'll chase those planes, and they'll run around. So that's an interesting concept. You had a little uh, phrase underneath that. I don't think you mentioned it. You had AI honeypots. Could you
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So imagine intelligent digital twins getting created dynamically and spun up, especially if you think that your organization is under attack, if you will. Creating these digital twins of what are the crown jewels of an organization and having them dynamically generate decoy content based on the real content and pushing those off to an isolated area of your network and then creating that as a lure to send attackers there. That's really an intelligent way to create these honeypots. I'm actually traveling tomorrow to speak 100% on a session on deception engineering because it is one of the mechanisms that really empowers defenders against AI centric or AI powered attacks.
I've always been they always talk about, in sports and stuff, defense wins, right? Defense wins, right? The difference between a regular season hockey game and a playoff hockey game is that the scores in the playoffs aren't 7-4 anymore. It's
Yeah.
2-1, or, really, 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 really kind of tight. Years ago, speaking of hockey, I took my youngest daughter to a game. It's their first one, and there's a penalty that comes up, and so on the scoreboard up comes the word, the letter D, and then defense. But my youngest daughter, having a very advanced vocabulary, goes, "What does D barrier mean?" And I said, "Barrier, that's defense." But when I think of the kinds of things you talked about, it's that's what it's that type of structure that you're trying to surround yourself with, or envelop yourself. I mean, we can't obviously, we can't dig any moats, right? We're not gonna, this isn't Monty Python, and we're doing moats around the castle or anything. But it's that kind of working on a defense mechanism. I mean, when you talk about that they behave like growth operations. I did a training a couple months ago, and on cybersecurity, and it was a film, and it was a training film, and the film was all about like an organization you just described. They had planning meetings. They had like, well, here's the Gantt chart for how the attack's going to happen, and it was just like I'm looking at that and it's like, oh my God, because you think of the one off, you think of the guy in the basement in Brooklyn someplace, right? And
No, those days are long behind
yeah,
us.
yeah, no, it's sophisticated business operations, and this is their business plan. They're
Yeah.
coming for you.
Yeah. No, and they, like I said in the beginning, they have budgets, they have deadlines, they have bosses. It has
Yeah,
become
they
a
have a list of KPIs, right? I mean, my
yeah.
God.
Yeah. I'm measuring you against these KPIs, right? It's fascinating how far it's come.
One of the classes I teach here at the college, I teach management, and we always talk about Michael Porter's five forces, right? And one of them is always one of the great things you always take, when you start a business, one of the great things you take solace in is the barrier to entry.
Hmm.
Right? That, this is a, oh, like, how they can't possibly build that kind of factory and stuff, and then come into the market, and then you look at the items that you outlined, and
Oh,
all of those curtains have come down. Those walls
it's
have come down.
it is literally zero. Think about this. So let's talk about an info stealer, for instance, which is probably the worst case malware that exists today. And so this is a piece of software that if you get on your machine will take artifacts from your machine and copy them to a remote location. If you go to an AI engine and tell it to write you a piece of malware, most of them will tell you I can't do that. But if you tell it to write a function, for example, that takes a file and copies it from point A to point B, there's nothing nefarious about that, is there? But that's exactly what an info stealer is doing. And so all of a sudden, I don't need to be a software engineer to create an info stealer. My intent is malicious in the use of what I just described, but the creation of it is not. And so even without looking at it from a dark LLM perspective, even just using, clear LLMs or non-malicious LLMs, you can still create malware.
Scary stuff, just scary. I mean, the scale you talked about, the facilitation. I mean, and the fact that I've also worked in consulting too, and one of the things I did was a defensive type of thing against takeovers. And one of the things we always used to talk about was what is the campaign? And
Mm.
and it's not a one-off, as you said it. It's this whole, here it is. Here's the timetable, here's the chart, here's when we launch, here's
Yeah.
all of that. That's just really, really.
Yeah. Here's content in 120 languages.
Well, thanks for being part of the good guys here and working on defense and working on defender operating models. And we hope our audience and the companies that we all work with take this seriously. I hope boards of directors, and certainly I mean, there's lots of stories, and you see in the business world about, oh, the attacks and things, but you think of like the old Colonial Pipeline, right? A couple of years ago, where all of a sudden there's no gas in the southeast
Yeah.
because of an attack like that. Companies, their boards, their advisors, they all need to take it seriously. How close, maybe Andres, just to wrap up, from a law enforcement standpoint, how closely do you see companies working with law enforcement in this area?
You know, this is one of those areas where I hate to say it this way, but size matters. The larger organizations actually do get the attention of, for example, the FBI or Interpol. The unfortunate reality is that those agencies don't have the resources to help every company, and every company's fair game to attackers. And so you see a lot of the SMBs and the smaller companies not getting the same level of attention. But I do think, to be fair to the law enforcement community, I do think that there is genuine concern there, and there are resources being applied to these problems. It's just a matter of how far you can get the help out there for these organizations.
Yeah, because you think of like I'm thinking some of the organizations that I've been involved with, or you hear about it, you think about it like traditional physical security, or you think of executive security, and oftentimes the people that are part of that have, oh, they're a former FBI agent, they're a retired, lieutenant from NYPD or something, and they have that FBI, they have that Justice Department, they have that kind of background because they realize what you're playing with, and that it's
Yeah.
not just change your password every 3 weeks. You know, it's
Yeah.
a lot, it's a lot more than that now.
I, I will say this. This game has gotten to a point where even most of the folks that you just referenced, they don't have the right mindset. They don't have the
Yeah,
capabilities.
yeah.
This
It's
is not
quickly. It's moved quickly. It's
yeah,
moved.
this is not a murder investigation in East New York, Brooklyn. This is on a large global scale.
Yeah, yeah. The draw the chalk lines isn't gonna cut it, right?
Oh,
Anymore. Well, listen, Andres, thank you for your expertise. Thanks for sharing here with us at our one artificial intelligence conference. And thanks for being with us last week in New York as well. Uh, I mean, we just, as they used to say in Hill Street Blues, be careful out there, right? For sure. As we go along. But thanks for all your expertise, and thanks for all the good you're doing, and the awareness and the assistance you're providing everyone. And we wish you continued luck, and good luck with your new book, and good luck with the conference tomorrow.
my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right, we'll see you next time. Thanks very
All
much.
right. Thank you.
Bye.